diesel electric submarines are, I think, a really good option for us. Nuclear submarines I love the idea of. But as you would agree, same with nuclear power. Nuclear submarines are not a quick fix to your immediate short-term needs. They are a serious strategic long-term investment that are good done at scale and, with all the infrastructure and culture and education and systems behind them. But you can't rush them. It's a really poor, slow solution to a fairly urgent problem.
Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by someone that my guests are probably quite familiar with at this point, Mr. Aidan Morrison. Welcome back, my friend. It's early here. It's late there. Thanks for making the time.
Glad to be chatting again, Chris.
And we are, not freshly off, but it's been a couple weeks. I had the pleasure of spending, at least 5 or 6 days on a road trip with you in the state of Victoria. And then this very busy speaking tour. Shout outs to St. Arned. I wanted to really, give those folks, if they're listening, I know there's some listeners in kind of rural farming Australia, but also Sydney, Melbourne, Gold Coast. It was a really fabulous time, Aidan. You're a wonderful host. And we had a lot of interesting conversations about energy, but you also have a lot of interest in I'm not sure exactly how to frame it. Naval tactics, military tactics, grand strategy. And we ended up kind of on the closing night having a really fascinating conversation where you started talking a little bit about what sensible Australian security policy might look like in terms of procurement and things like that. I had an interesting overlay with energy. And so I thought this is fascinating. We sort of live in what I'll sort of maybe charitably call a fantasy-rich time in terms of energy planning, and I think that is the product of easy times. The famous quote: "Soft times make soft men make hard times make hard men." I think we're in a soft time sort of cycle, or maybe a soft men cycle. Sorry. And soft, I don't know, whatever. I'll just stick with the language. But, not necessarily thinking in ways that are, as pragmatic. And my sort of key example of this is the ways in which Chinese energy policy is, I think, much less of a decarbonization policy and much more of an energy security policy, with a critical dependence in China on imports of liquid hydrocarbons driving a lot of the electrification, particularly of oil heavy uses like transportation. So I'm going to try not to monologue too much in the intro, but just by way of introduction of what it is I think we're going to talk about today, that's what I had in mind, Aidan.
Yeah, excellent. That sounds good, and I agree. We've had our head in the sand somewhat, the very soft sand of a very peaceful era in Australia. The last 15, 20 years, a bit more since the end of the Cold War, have been the easiest we've had probably ever, and I think that we've just not started thinking seriously about it at all, unfortunately. So I don't know. Where else would you like me to start? Give me a leaping point.
Well, by way again, I have now been to Australia twice. Grand total of about 4 weeks. Those have been very productive, intensive 4 weeks. I've met some really big movers and shakers, and I think had an interesting exposure. That being said, I'm bone ignorant. But, I remember stepping away from my first trip being like, okay, this is a fascinating place. Like it starts as a, British colony, becomes a U.S. colony, is now a Chinese colony. And obviously it's far more complex than that, but maybe it's worth sort of talking a little bit about maybe it's a bit of grand sweeping bit of history, Australia's kind of alliances and the pickle, I think, that it finds itself in now, being very heavily dependent on China for trade. I mean, that incredible Pillsborough iron ore field that has just been feeding the blast furnaces of China and contributing so much to their industrialization and a sort of bilateral, trade network there. At the same time, importing much of its energy kit now from China in the form of solar panels, batteries, inverters, et cetera. Anyway, I'll sort of spew that out there as a potential starting point. But I think, getting a bit of background in terms of historical strategic alliances and the current potential vulnerabilities might be a good place to start.
Yeah, great. Australia is said to have grown up on the sheep's back. That's the kind of catchphrase that we use to describe how we sort of were originally set up as more or less a commodity exporting country. We were sort of a colony that was growing stuff that was feeding an external empire, that was the British Empire. And so wool was the first kind of big kind of export commodity that made Australia well, as rich as we were back then, which wasn't bad, right? Like, so we've got prodigious amounts of space, obviously land, and so you can grow stuff and send it back overseas. Very closely tied to the British Empire, of course, and our strategic policy has been oriented around this idea of kind of more or less sending military tribute in times of need to the protecting kind of empire that was protecting us. So the British Empire, and this kind of, it's sort of worked in World War One in a sense that we sort of, so we're part of some spectacular military debacles and some outrageous successes actually as well. And Australians have a very proud place to play in the sort of, the pioneering of combined arms warfare in World War One. But this idea of sending some stuff, sending some soldiers, sending some troops, sending some raw young, manpower from the countryside of Australia to wherever the war was fought by whoever was fighting it, so that they would protect us in times of need. It was sort of relatively key, sort of Australian affair. Now, we did buy a few things too. We bought some ships and that sort of stuff off them as well, which was sort of, sort of adjunct to kind of their military presence in this region. That might be, there'd probably be lots of naval people saying, oh no, it was much more than that. It was very, very important. But in the end, I think that World War II kind of crystallized how this relationship worked out for us. And we sort of had, we had a pretty hopeless defence force. Our air force was sort of scattered out a little bit in Indonesia, etc. Performed terribly, was sort of annihilated as soon as the Japanese sort of came through there. And we had 16,000 troops, which we'd sent to Singapore, trusting that the Singaporeans would basically, or it's not the Singaporeans, the British who had the outpost of Singapore, would defend their patch, like it was a British patch, Southeast Asia, sort of based around Singapore. And the British sent a little squadron of warships, a little squadron of heavy warships, and they were basically annihilated by the Japanese in a couple of days. And then we had nothing. We had 16,000 soldiers, which is not a small contingent for an Australian sort of expeditionary force, taken prisoners of war, sort of relatively early in the pointy bits of World War II for us. It's an absolute debacle. So we'd kind of put faith in the naval supremacy of the British Empire, and that didn't work. And that was overrun. And the key thing is that Australia, we didn't realise this, but after basically Pearl Harbor, it was not long after that the Japanese sort of went all the way down through the Southeast Asia, the archipelago there. It took them about 4 to 5 months before they'd got all the way as far as they would get. So it started very, very quickly down the Malaysian Peninsula, and using effective maritime warfare were basically, that was more or less unfettered. The British had been defeated. They sort of left the theatre. Very quickly they could sort of conquer what's now Indonesia in a matter of months by lily-padding, in very, very quick steps. And so we ended up being kind of literally throwing ourselves over to the mercy of another naval power, to ask them to see whether they could stop the onslaught and sort of, turn the tide in this region. And thankfully they could. I mean, but all these sort of things we look at in hindsight now, it's sort of, we're glad that's the way it turned out. But it was a pretty near thing at the time. And so the Battle of the Coral Sea was the first major battle that was fought by fleets that never saw each other. It was an aircraft carrier battle. And that was the point where we basically relied on the Americans to turn around a naval force that would have put Japanese forces in the Port Moresby area, which is sort of the part of Papua New Guinea that's just spitting distance from Australia. And that would have been like really the closing out of Australia's strategic freedom in a nutshell. And we ended up, that naval task force was turned around, or stopped, destroyed in that naval battle strategically. It's sort of, simplifying a lot of things. But then at that point, the Japanese tried to come overland, and our next big something of a success, a very difficult success, the Kokoda Trail, was basically us fighting this horrendous rearguard action, which did just stop the Japanese from getting overland to this southern Port Moresby, which would have sort of secured their kind of, more or less control of all of our northern approaches. So that's where it stopped. So we kind of became dependent entirely on another country's sort of naval forces being able to turn back a sort of an onslaught in our region. And as far as the kind of connection with our supply chains and what our economy is, like we are still an export-oriented country that exports commodities, massive amounts of, and still agricultural goods, but far, far larger by volume and by value is the mining produce we have. So iron ore in particular is massive. Liquefied natural gas is also really substantial. Coal is really big. They're the kind of massive ones, but a whole range of other mineral products that we have, we export a lot of to the world. So that's sort of what we are today. But our military kind of strategy to secure that has been sort of have a boutique, smallish in peacetime, but we sort of scale it up in wartime force that we send as a sort of, expeditionary tribute to wherever else the kind of parent empire is fighting. And we've sort of done that in Vietnam, we've done that in Iraq, we've done that wherever else. We've had a kind of an elite boutique, highly expeditionary, highly skilled kind of, military tribute to pay to some other part of the world where someone else is fighting, and that's been our strategy for a long time. And now I think it's I think it's possibly was a poor strategy for longer, but right now it's a pretty appallingly bad one. So yeah, anyway, that's my quick run of that.
No, that was excellent. And it's fascinating because the tyranny of I think it's the Peterson projection, right, that makes southern hemisphere land masses look tiny and Greenland look absolutely outrageously large. Certainly gave me the sense that Australia was a smaller place than it is, but it is this massive continent that's quite sparsely populated in a neighborhood of highly populous nations. Maybe not quite as resource rich, but it finds itself in a kind of interesting position, all by itself in terms of a kind of Western outpost, shall we put it. Again, super resource rich, population poor. There's the saying I've heard over there that Australia basically has everything it needs. I mean, it's a continent after all, in terms of those natural resources, but with one exception. And I talked in the intro about China's strategic vulnerability, particularly when it comes, there's demographic vulnerabilities, there's a whole bunch of different vulnerabilities, but, oil is the lifeblood of any modern industrialized economy. And they import, I think, something like 80% of their oil, much of it from the Middle East, much of it through the Straits of Malacca, which I think gets down to only several kilometers wide at a certain point. And just looking at that mess of islands in the Indo-Pacific and, the first island chain and the second island chain, as it's referred to, it's a bloody mess for China in terms of the potential for military blockade. I guess that's probably why there's militarization of the South China Sea and a desire to potentially be able to blitzkrieg those areas in the case of a great power, hot war conflict. So leaving that aside and China's dependence on oil and some of its energy moves to lessen that, I'm sort of laying the trap here, but what is it that Australia might be highly dependent on, and how does that impact its strategic posture as, again, a continental power? It's a continent, but really not that should be a maritime power but just simply doesn't have the population or the resources of the industrial base to be a maritime power, and is dependent on other maritime powers to safeguard its strategic position.
I think I'm not even sure whether I agree with that final conclusion about whether we can be a maritime power or whether we still depend on maritime powers or not. We might come back to the kind of the military technical dynamics that underpin that. But just on that question of kind of what do we depend upon? I think that to a first approximation, you're absolutely right. Like liquid hydrocarbons is the first thing that we are short of. We import about 90% of our oil. So that's our weakness. And I think it's worth pointing out that Australia as a country as well, we are somewhat more dependent, if that's possible, than I think most places on liquid hydrocarbons. And that's because we're so sort of sparsely, we're a massive continent. Transport for us matters. Overland transport matters. We're also highly agricultural. I don't know if you've noticed any efforts to get heavy tractors to be electrified, but agriculture is heavy work and hydrocarbons do the heavy lifting. And the other thing as well that is very, probably slightly less so, but mining and mining operations, remote mining operations and trucking, hauling, crushing, stuff like that. So hydrocarbons are what makes Australia tick. Very heavy truck. We have a little bit of rail, but it's not amazing, to be honest. So in terms of the transport and keeping these moving around Australia and digging stuff, turning dirt and digging dirt, hydrocarbons are pretty important to us. And we import almost all of them. and not just that. I think that we've taken it to. We by the way do have lots of hydrocarbons, just not liquid ones in bulk. We do get a little bit of oil from more or less a byproduct of other gas fuels that we have in relative abundance. So there's little scratches of oil here and there in Australia, but there's heaps of gas, and there is stupendous amounts of coal. Like we have energy in ridiculous abundance, just not heaps of the liquid stuff at the moment. So that's what we need badly. That's the critical thing that we need. And Australia is kind of a funny country because we send away, like we are abundantly blessed with every possible bulky material that we need. In terms of, we've got food, we've got water. Not every country has water, right? Singapore, like it's complicated. You've got to salinate or pipe some from Malaysia. But we have water and food and iron ore, alumina, like all the bulky metals, anything you care to poke stick at that is bulky, we have in spectacular abundance. There are it's the refined stuff and the liquid fuels. Like there are a few refined metals, which much of the West is dependent on China for refinement capacity of. And it comes down to as well, the other things we import a lot of are manufactured goods, including electronics, including our solar panels, right? And including our motors and wind turbines. And we import a fair few chemicals as well. And so manufactured stuff is what Australia imports. And there's a tiny volume of it. We send away by tons, like 10 times as much stuff as we ever receive imported, including the fuel. Like it's still tiny compared to the bulk of stuff we send away. We get rich by sending stuff overseas, mostly to Asia. That's the other thing. It's like the bulk that we send to Chinese steel mills and Korean and Japanese. And we provide them with lots of liquid gas as well and coal, and some in India too. But we send bulk to Asia and we receive back manufactured goods, including sort of high-end consumer electronics and cheap T-shirts and sneakers and, garden furniture and textiles and like everything else that sort of makes an Australian sort of comfortable house. But that's where we are. We send away the bulk to Asia and we bring back manufactured stuff from Asia, which puts us in a sort of niche area where we depend on those shipping routes to Asia to get rich. But we only depend on them for critical things that we really rely on for oil at the moment, including refined products. We basically import most of our stuff refined from places like Singapore, Korea, India. So we're utterly dependent. We've got a time. We only refine about 20%, I think, of our products here in Australia. So we import just in time refined liquid materials, and we meant to only have like something like a month reserve. Like Australia stops after 28 days, something like that, 24 days, something ridiculous, if we are cut off from the world. And at the moment, the world is that imported stuff that goes through that mess of Southeast Asia that China looks like they're pretty much ready to grab in an instant if they need to, which they might want to because of their own dependence on imported liquid hydrocarbons.
Yeah, I mean, so this is wild because there's certainly a narrative, and it comes out of China that, we are not an imperial power. We're not like the colonial West. I mean, they've had this century of humiliation. They have seized Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia at times. They've been in Vietnam and Korea, obviously. I guess more from a sort of continental than maritime expansion. And there was a brief period, I forget, I think in the 15th or 16th century when Chinese had a huge kind of naval
fleet,
more marine, merchant marine fleet.
Yeah.
But that was a big anomaly. But they say, listen, I mean, we're a peaceful nation. And so, this illustration of this mess of islands, as we're calling them, which is probably offensive to some of our Filipino listeners, et cetera. It is in contention, and it has, really important sort of strategic relevance, particularly as you're saying, because Australia, my perception again is, I mean, not that I thought Australia was self-sufficient, but thinking as it's sort of part of the West, its trade networks must touch more of the West, despite the huge geographic distances. It makes sense that they're, importing things that are being, again, refined in this juicy, globalized, peaceful world that we've had, with U.S. naval hegemony, sort of guaranteeing freedom of navigation, just getting it the easy way. And, the way we've been able to lean into comparative advantage with globalization has, been pretty wonderful. But as we've sort of been reflecting on, these are kind of soft times, and, who knows what's ahead. Hopefully more peace, more trade, et cetera. But this idea that we might need to, prepare for, or at least be thinking about particularly the energy implications of that. One thing you said in our conversation at that beautiful restaurant dinner was what the Australian kind of naval capacity would be put to work at in the setting of a, I could say, hot war or a potential sort of an end to freedom of navigation. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. Look,
as it ties into energy.
I think that it's. I think that quickly, Australia's a pretty small surface fleet. We've got 9, 10 frigates and 3 destroyers, air warfare destroyers we call them, which is probably a mistake. They're a general purpose destroyer. So, you count on your fingers the number of ships we have available, or we have in total, actually. The number of ships that are available is probably much less than that, actually. But Australia, if there was a hot war, we would basically be dependent within days of basically running some sort of fuel convoy to wherever we can get the fuel to and from, and making sure that stays secure and safe. And at the moment, I mean, that's really worth speculating about where we actually end up going to, because at the moment we currently import entirely from Southeast Asia or India and the Gulf, but where that would be if you were export from allies. Happily, the United States now produce lots of oil. Would be depend on them. So more or less, the Australian Navy would be busy in an instant, I think, trying to kind of run some sort of convoy escort system to make sure that we're safe-ish from sort of long-range raiding ships, submarines, and long-range aircraft and missiles, that sort of things, drones that might be coming out. So, we're dependent more or less immediately and entirely on that lifeblood of liquid oil. And we consume in Australia, I did a little bit of reading, it's something like sort of roughly 3 ships per day. There's sort of about 1,000 kind of port calls of tanker fuel that come into Australia, at least a couple of years ago. So if you think about that, there's sort of 3 ships per day. But if you think about, we've got a month of fuel lined up, straight away you need ships planned for weeks away. And we're a couple of weeks sail away from the United States or the Gulf, right, of a slow-moving carrier. So planning straight away, where are the ships? Get them loaded, get your fleet to kind of get them safely there. It sort of occupies that immediately. Which brings you, I suppose, I think, to these kind of very hard questions about, is that a good use of our Navy? And do we think that it is sufficient for that purpose? And I think that that gets you to really interesting questions about whether that's even going to work for us or not. And I think the really hard questions in sort of naval warfare start with kind of the easy statements about what you think is necessary, and then move to harder questions about whether you actually can produce a sufficient force to do what you could easily conclude was necessary. And sometimes you realize that you can't actually do sufficient of a task that you think is necessary, like escort. And so you should think about whether actually your strategy should make that necessary or not. And you come back sort of, with fairly ugly conclusions that maybe this is not something that that you can rely on or should do at all. And so you end up sort of having to reverse the comfortable statements that you thought were easy and safe, like Australia's a maritime nation. Therefore, we need to defend our maritime trade with ships that go with it, and these sort of axioms, and sort of start thinking through, actually, how does that look? What sort of surface ships and how many of you would you need them? Escorting how many different places at once? And how do you think those ships survive in certain parts of the world? And you realize that you just might not be able to do sufficient amounts of the things that you thought were necessary to do. And you've got to reevaluate your entire strategy, which gets kind of scary.
Yeah, I mean, what is the alternative paradigm here? You're mentioning, and again, in one of our earlier conversations, in kind of the age of the sail and the wooden ship, ships were harder to sink and easier to sort of privateer, commandeer, capture, maybe more of an aggressive posture. And now with, it's too simplistic, but with metal ships and missiles, they're easier to sink. How does that change that axiom you're mentioning of, okay, we're a maritime power, we should be able to protect convoys, and we should have sufficient naval strength to do that, which just sounds impossible given how much Australia has to import in terms of, liquid hydrocarbon lifeblood, but also a lot of other manufactured products, which it just doesn't have the economic complexity to do for itself.
I think that's a contentious. It's contentious. It's been barely put and tested, but the idea that ships are defended or defendable I think that's got some serious reckoning coming for it. Basically, like, ships are big and slow moving. They're stuck in a two-dimensional plane, which means that one of the three dimensions you might have to solve for where they are and how to navigate to is done for you. So, and they're really big. Like, compared to a plane or a tank or a helicopter or anything else we fight with, they're like sort of 10 times as long and 5 times as wide. And so, yeah, ships I think are kind of are amazingly hard to really defend from a serious attack now. And it wasn't always the case. As I mentioned, the age of sail was a totally different time. I think this is a magical moment in military history, if you like, where the kind of Aidan's 2 cents on how to win a serious fight did not apply. Like, my 2 cents on how to win a serious fight is with the largest number of the smallest thing that can get a lethal weapon into battle. That's how land forces and how air forces work today. Navies somehow are inverted. And they're inverted because back in the age of sail, it was the other way around for them. Because basically, as a ship got bigger and bigger, the number of guns you had pointing out of a broadside went up with the area of that broadside, of the side of the ship. So you got longer and you got taller at the center, you had another deck on, and you suddenly had many, many more guns. And it was impossible basically because of how the guns only fired kind of like, a couple hundred yards. You couldn't mass lots and lots and lots of tiny ships to outnumber the number of guns because they'd run into each other. You literally couldn't do it. So you can only put...
This is an age of the sail.
Age of sail, right? So you could not accumulate superior firepower by having lots of small vessels in the age of sail. Physically impossible. That's why ships of the line were like, you get your biggest ships and just the biggest ships. And they were the ones that could fight because they would get one other ship alongside them. And if you weren't up to match that other ship, you were done, right? The frigates stayed back. They were mopping up operations, right? So the ships of the line were the only ones, and the bigger the ship, pretty much, the better you were at fighting because you could concentrate more cannons on that other ship and destroy more of the people on board. And that's the other thing is wooden ships didn't sink very well. They were really, really hard to sink. There was so much stuff you could throw out of the top of them that they pretty much had to only sank when they got burned to the waterline. And that's when they sank. But for most of these major battles, like the ships that were lost were taken over. Like they had guys literally jump on with swords and finish off, and that's how they ended up losing their ships, right? And so you struck your colours when you lost so many people on your ship that you couldn't fight, and you didn't want to have it blown up anymore. But ships didn't sink, and so stealing ships was very attractive in the age of sail because you come alongside, and if you turned up with more cannons and more people with swords to jump on board, you could steal the ship and take it somewhere else and sell all the goods on it. And so it was very profitable to steal ships. Piracy was very profitable for a long time, very good reason, because you had to jump on board ships and you could steal them and get away with that and take them to a harbour somewhere else on the other side of the world and no one would ever know about it, no one would ever chase you for it. But yeah, in the modern day, where basically the weapons and the sensors can massively sort of go beyond that sort of near range of engagement that we had sort of, a glorified stone's throw in the age of sail, where they'd literally come up. Sometimes the cannons were almost touching, right, when they would pass, for these close encounters. Like Nelson was famous for sort of these, going really, really close. A few of the other and uses carronades, which is ultra short range cannons. So anyway, there's so much more I can tell you about that. But yeah, age of sail, they fought a glorified stone's throw apart, and then they jumped on and finished it like, more or less hand to hand. But since we've got these long range guns and weapons, ships have there's never been a sustainable point where getting to a bigger ship made more sense. We tried this. We had the age of iron, kind of steel long range guns, and you realized you wanted the bigger guns, you had a lot more range. A bigger gun, you had more range. Bigger gun, you had more range. And we had this escalation, and it ended in World War II when they realized, guess what? You put one bomb on one small plane and then scale it up and have a few hundred of them, and they always get through. And you can't put enough guns on the ship to stop that from happening. And more or less the same things happen now. So anyway, that's a bit of a ramble, but basically, like, ships are easier to be attacked by large numbers of small things, and that's been borne out. I think it was borne out in the Second World War very strongly, both with aircraft and small surface vessels. And now Ukraine is sort of proving that can be done again in the modern era as well, with sort of jet skis and sort of jet ski engines on canoes laden with explosives, pretty much that sort of thing, and small drones, right? So ships are, the big expensive ships are easy to sink, and now I think that basically trade is kept safe by mutually assured economic destruction not by the escort of naval vessels. We have so much global trade today that it is literally impossible for us to have an escorting vessel assigned to even a tiny fraction of it, right? Like, we don't send ships on escort duty, except it's against non-state actors, tiny little kind of piracy sort of patrols. But against main state actors, it's deterrence. Like, if you interfere with our shipping, we'll interfere with yours, and we can do that so easily, so lethally, that everyone loses so badly that we agree not to do that until we step into this major threshold of war. But then if you do that, I think the conclusion you come to very rapidly is that ships, by virtue of them being such big, relatively easy targets, with so many ways of trying to saturate and overwhelm their systems, particularly if you're close to land, and you always might be close to land through the Southeast Asia, and you can get sort of short-range drones, large numbers of small things to access them. The conclusion you come to is that you can't sail ships against a determined aggressor that can kind of mass small drones like, gunfire or artillery or lots of coordinated missiles like saturation attacks for and Western powers do the same thing. Like if you want to take out a ship, you send not 2, not 5, but 10, 20, 30, 50 missiles at the same time, and some of them tend to get through eventually. The defenses might work for the first 2 or 3, but there's a number which gets through, and against a threat like China in somewhat like the South China Sea, I don't think there is any credible argument for any sort of Australian escort, or anyone else's for that matter, that would be like, I'm going to sail right past, all the way up to export to Korea and expect we're going to defend against, like Chinese missiles. It's just not a consideration. So Australia really has to put a hand on that part of the map and say, we can't assume any ships go there, and there's nothing we will do about it, which changes where we send our ships and what we think we will do to defend them quite a bit. But you better jump in. What have I missed? What did I mangle?
Well, yeah, no. I mean, this is probably just an obvious conclusion that everyone else is reaching. But you're talking about the scaling up of warships, but we've also, with globalization and trade and economies of scale being what they are, scaled massively up. Our very large container ships or our very large crude oil ships. So a similar sort of process and greater vulnerability has arrived there. You mentioned 1,000 tankers a year coming to Australia. Those are big tankers, big targets. Not super nimble, et cetera. So I think that is a really fascinating insight. I'm wondering if AUKUS is kind of like the pregnant idea in the room here right now. But where does it fit into this whole thing? Or finish your earlier thought.
Sorry, I've got a thought. I do want to finish just on the observation that ships got bigger, right? And I think there is just a dynamic here which is just so important to flesh out, right? Is that as you scale things up, your surface area to volume ratio changes so that you get more internal stuff, more volume inside for the external skin that you have to push through the water. So basically, your economies of scale naturally improve as you get bigger. There's no limit to that, right? So in peacetime, you want to get the biggest ship basically that is not impractical to dock or port or get through a canal, right? So bigger things and concentrations always work better in terms of the raw physics of it, surface area to volume ratio. But the problem is that your surface is also pretty much determines how easy you are to see and hit, all right? And those two things are independent events. And so by basic statistics, basically the probability of those two things combined, which multiplies those probabilities together, means that you end up with like being big is very bad in a fight because it's easier for you to be seen and hit. And that scales with R to the 4, whereas your advantage in terms of your economies of scale scales with just R. So anyway, this is a natural relationship which is inevitable. This won't be invented away ever. This is hardwired into physics that it will be bigger it will be better in peacetime to trade with bigger and bigger vessels. But in wartime, it will always be much, much harder to defend those from an onslaught of smaller things. And smaller things don't go as far, which means that you'll be vulnerable from short-range attacks. But that's absolutely how it goes, and technology will not change the dynamic. So we've enjoyed the fruits of basically scaling up our transport activities into larger and larger vessels. But that gets crushed in a moment when you end up in a wartime situation where somebody else's economies of how easy it is for them to disrupt you basically can prey on those very big things. There's a limited number of targets to seek, and they're easy to find and they're easy to hit. It just comes collapsing down the other direction. But let's move on to what does that mean for the next step. You want to say about something at AUKUS?
Where does that fit in? I mean, what kind of submarines? I mean, I think we know they're like nuclear attack submarines, but what's the strategic vision there? What are the limitations of Australia's current subsurface navy? Why do you need nuclear submarines? Do you need them?
Yeah.
Is the purpose to escort and convoy marine ships, or do mutually assured economic destruction, sinking Chinese or other adversaries, merchant marine?
Absolutely, that's a really, really good question. And Australia's submarine strategy and the world's submarine strategy, I think there's a danger of terrible confusion, because people may mistake what you need the ships for with what you mostly do with them. All right. And military assets are meant for what you might need them for in wartime. And yet we have them in peace, and we do stuff with them too. Some practicing for war, but also lots of stuff like intelligence gathering, right? So submarines are used a lot for that every day. And so it's very easy for people to sort of get into the habit of saying, submarines, they're really just about the intelligence and being able to snoop around and listen to various things. But my pretty firm opinion is that submarines are amazingly good at one thing, and that is sinking ships. Basically, it's really, really hard to find submarines underwater that are completely underwater. It's pretty easy to find ships which are both a bit underwater and a bit on top of the water, and they have cavitating propellers. There's a whole bunch of other disadvantages. So subs are great for sinking ships, really, really great for sinking ships. Now, Australia's diesel electric submarines, all diesel electric submarines are great for sinking ships that are caught in a space where they're going to come. And that's because diesel electric submarines are slow, really, really slow. So I liken them to, my simple metaphor is snakes and wolves. Diesel electric submarines are like snakes. You hide them in a thicket and you wait for your prey to come and step on you, right? And when your prey does, you are lethal, right? But nuclear submarines can go fast for speed. In fact, they can chase down ships more or less in the open ocean, which is literally impossible because of physics. I can expand on that if you want, but for a diesel electric submarine, they just can't maintain. They move at a glorified walking pace underwater. It's like 4 knots would be a patrol speed, right? So they go really, really slow when underwater. And on the surface, when they're transiting, it's sort of like, it's sort of somewhat secret, they say, but it's 8, maybe 10 knots.
Wow,
so
that's it.
This is
and a nuclear sub, how fast?
Well, nuclear submarines can, and again, it's all classified, but everyone sort of knows roughly. It's sort of mid to late 20s, and some of the ones they built in the Cold War are up to mid 30s potentially, or low, maybe mid 30s. It's all very vague and hand wavy around there. So, and to put that in perspective, like a big heavy cargo ship would go at sort of 12 to 14 knots or something like that, which is faster, by the way, than a diesel electric submarine could keep up with at all, right? So diesel electric submarines have to be pre-positioned in the place that they are going to strike their prey. So that means that basically diesel electric submarines are excellent for Australia if what we want them to do is to block shipping through the archipelago, that thicket that plasters our north. Like diesel electric submarines are very good for that. But Australia has another idea, and the merit of this idea is, I think, not unfortunately tested strongly enough by, I think, the broader kind of commentariat in Australia, that we need our submarines to go all the way to basically China's doorstep and do things there. And there are things that might be very good to do there, like lay mines in an emergency. That might be a very effective thing to do there. But I think the thing that Australians Navy mostly loves doing there is exercises with the Americans, right? It's like that's pretty much what Australia's Defence Force loves to do.
Military tribute.
That's right. We're trained to pay military tribute, and we feel really good at doing that is when we're doing exercises alongside the Americans. So Americans concerned about something like around Korea, Japan, or Taiwan. Australia's best thing we feel like we can be doing is locking arms and doing that sort of stuff with them. So I think that in Australia's kind of mentality, it's very important for us to be able to go a long way. I think that's actually probably a second tier priority for us, because it's the Indonesian archipelago that is our patch, and that being overrun is the last and worst defense. And so whilst it'd be nice to do things further north than that too, the very, very, very most important thing is making sure that can't be overrun quickly. And diesel electric submarines, I think, are pretty good at that, actually. And they don't need to be any more long range than the current ones we have to be pretty good at that. But Australia's got this unique position where we would love to have nuclear submarines because they can transit so much faster, right? Just so much faster, right? So our patch, our thicket that we need to kind of patrol in is a long way from our southern ports and our major naval bases and our population centres, which is where submariners live mostly, right? So, and a long way from potential airstrikes as well too. So we've got a long way to go through the open ocean to get to our kind of thicket that we would like to patrol in. And I actually think that this is
So the submarine bases are not in Darwin. They're not on the north.
no. We've only got one, and it's in Perth, West Australia, right? So it's still like, you know. And so you've got like an Australian submarine voyage looks like a week or so before you get somewhere interesting, right? You're literally just cruising for a week before you're on station, somewhere remotely interesting. And then if you want to do the, you know, fun stuff with the Americans, it's another week or so through the Indonesian archipelago before you get somewhere else really interesting, a bit further north, like the South China Sea. And a better part of a week more if you want to get to Taiwan or somewhere like, if you can make it that far, which is probably stretching the range a bit. Anyway, so hugely long commutes for Australian submarines to get on station. And the rationale for Australia having nuclear submarines is that compresses that commute time so much, right? Because you can go, instead of like 7 or 8 or 9 knots, you're going at sort of 25 or 30. So you've got more time on station, which is the useful metric for what Australia wants to do. Wherever it is, like how many subs you can have on station is a pretty useful, workable metric. But I think that leads you into a space where maybe a smaller number of nuclear submarines could do a pretty good job. But my own thought is that nuclear submarines also have another advantage, is that if we want to do anything that might involve interdicting shipping anywhere that's not in that archipelago, then nuclear submarines are essential. There's just no chance that anywhere else, like far away, that's not in that archipelago, that a diesel electric submarine is going to be able to correctly anticipate and maneuver in front of in the deep open ocean. Unless we have perfect intelligence and we know exactly where they're going. That it just doesn't happen. They have to wait in a thicket. And so nuclear submarines add extra value in the sense there's more options. If you want to be able to keep up with a fleet that you escort somewhere else, nuclear submarines can do that, which diesel electric submarines just can't. No type of fleet they can escort. They're just for laying that trap, which is important and good, but they're only for that one thing. So nuclear submarines would be nice. I think Australia, though, if you don't mind me continuing, has a better case than any country in the world for both, right? And again, we have got a small kind of, we think of ourselves as being hard-pressed, not able to do very much militarily, but it's worth us contemplating that if submarines are important, we have a better case than anyone in the world for both, because we are, I think, more or less the only country that wants to and needs to mostly fight in a thicket, but has to cross an open ocean to get there, right? That is not China's problem. China has to break out of the thicket to get to the open ocean, right? To be able to kind of go somewhere, right? That is not France or the UK's problem. They have open ocean on coasts right there, right? Direct access. United States, open ocean everywhere, right? And that, and so it's an obvious choice when you've only got to, cross an open ocean, and that's where you want to be. But when you've got to cross an open ocean and then fight in a thicket, you've got an interesting conundrum, because diesel electric submarines are good value in a thicket. And I think the obvious choice, and it's not technically done yet, unfortunately, but I think it could be, is that we should basically have a combined fleet or team up with some allies and figure out how to tow our diesel electric submarines into the thicket from theatre. That's the obvious, I think, from a physics sense, because you can basically cut down that commute. And the drag equations just work out so beautifully that basically you'd only have to trade a few knots off the top speed of a nuclear submarine, and it could tow basically another submarine or two behind it, right? So it's just the way the physics works out with the basically your energy consumption scales with velocity squared. So it's.
Is that done? Is that done anywhere?
No, it's not. It's not. But no one else has a motive like we do to do it. So I think that it's worth thinking about, and I've thought about how that would look, and I don't think it's impossible at all. But anyway, but in the short term, I think Australia has kind of bought into the idea of us getting the nuclear submarines, and that was done more or less by accident, and more or less as an arse covering exercise, in my opinion, because we committed to buying the French diesel electric submarines, which were pretty much given a bait and switch on the pump jet propulsion system, which pairs terribly badly with a diesel electric submarine, but then insisted we keep the pump jet system, and so that was headed for a train wreck. And I think that the nuclear submarine option was pretty much just a way of cancelling a train wreck of a submarine procurement.
And we will refer our listeners now to your video on Miltech and TAC,
Sure.
where you go into that because I know that's a fascinating story. But yeah, it's interesting because there was such broad political consensus behind AUKUS. I think people maybe expected Labour would not get in line. Why was it that political consensus, given that from what you're saying, I mean, you're saying there is a rationale, but it's really unconventional in terms of like towing diesel electric subs into position. I mean, for me, it's in terms of value on money spent, as an armchair military strategist, which I am not. I mean, not even in the armchair. I'm sitting on the floor somewhere in the back of the room. It would make sense, with investing the limited dollars you have, to probably just get a whole bunch more diesel electric subs and get a lot more for value, and say, you know what, US, UK, France, you take care of this long range missions, and we'll just set up and infest this thicket of these Indo-Pacific islands and be a real pain in the ass for Chinese shipping or whatever it might be. Comparative advantage. So why was there this snap political consensus amongst all major? I'm not sure if the Greens backed AUKUS, but whatever. Who cares about the Greens?
No, the Greens didn't. They called them floating Chernobyls. So that was what the Greens thought. Yeah. Look, you're absolutely right. I think that in Australia's situation, just to reflect on what you said, I mean, in terms of what we need in the immediate short term, and Australia's everyone's, the West's strategic vulnerabilities in the next 10 years, maybe 20 years. But diesel electric submarines are, I think, a really good option for us. Nuclear submarines I love the idea of. But as you would agree, same with nuclear power. Nuclear submarines are not a quick fix to your immediate short-term needs. They are a serious strategic long-term investment that are good done at scale and, with all the infrastructure and culture and education and systems behind them. But you can't rush them, right? So I think that Australia's in a terrible position now because we've put ourselves where we are in a blind, mad rush for a formidable but extremely slowly acquired strategic capability. And that's I think silly as well, and particularly given that the capacity to build these things is basically we might be cannibalizing our allies' capacity to have ships in their fleet so that we can have some in our fleet, and then trying to figure out how we can build some of a joint design there, but then here later. I think it's just a kind of it's the most laughable kind of it's a really poor, slow solution to a fairly urgent problem. I mean, I would love to aspire towards nuclear submarines in the long term, but not in the short term. So why did Australia suddenly snap around and be like, okay, that sounds like a great idea? I think that Australians, in terms of our intelligentsia and political class and even our punter class, I think that we do not follow the intricacies of different submarine types closely at all. I think that there has been a lot of talk amongst Australian naval commentators about how nuclear submarines might be good. It's sort of one of these perennial kind of zombie things that comes up all the time. But everyone's been too afraid of nuclear and just that the public wouldn't like it for a long time. So I think the story there that's really come out, the AUKUS kind of snap, everyone being happy with AUKUS all of a sudden, is one of basically the political class having misjudged the public's fear of nuclear badly, right? The public has relatively little fear of nuclear overall, and I think AUKUS proved that. But what happened is that Australians just heard there was a chance for a better submarine. That's all they heard. Between nuclear and I still hear politicians say this. It makes me want to scream, but we've just upgraded. We've gone from the 4th generation to 5th generation, diesel electric to nuclear. It's the most completely physics and propulsion unaware kind of arguments in the world. They're totally different creatures, like wolves and snakes, right? Wolves can run down a long distance, hot blood, heartbeat. Snakes hide in a thicket, cold blood. They're just totally different. But I think that Australians and most of our intelligentsia as well just heard an upgrade. There's an upgrade on offer, and the Australian public was kind of like, no, we're not too scared of nuclear to have an upgrade. We'd like that. Thank you very much. And it was done on a dime, and no one's looked back, right? So that's I think the huge catch is that Australians weren't as scared of nuclear. Australian politicians and the political class, in a very, very small-minded kind of small target, don't rock the boat, don't propose anything kind of way, had persuaded themselves that nuclear was inherently unpopular, and it's not. And I think the energy debate we're having now is also proving that. Australians are very open to nuclear. All that fear and backlash that we expected is not there. It's just required some politicians to go and say, hey, how about this? And then Australia's like, yeah, how about it?
So let's talk a little bit about we still have a decent if you're willing to stay up later, we have a little time left.
Lots more to talk about, so we better keep going. Yeah.
Oh God, there's so much to get into here, but I think like again at our fateful dinner conversation, we talked a bit about okay, Aidan, like you're in charge of procurement or grand strategy here. What do you do? And it was from what I recall, it was sort of like it was a nuanced conversation, and I do want to keep sowing energy into this conversation. As you mentioned, this dependence on liquid hydrocarbons is a major big deal. And so what we might think of as rearmament and procurement might have to do with things that don't actually look like naval ships or weapon systems, but more just patching up your energy security situation. And again, I think that's very much the case with China, where, I think their economy is now something like 30 or 32 or 33% electrified. I think I was looking up Australia's more in the mid 20s. That delta maybe doesn't seem huge, but it's a big deal. And obviously electrification makes sense for a whole variety of reasons, certainly going back in terms of industrial revolution, various prime movers, electric motors are absolutely amazing. But again, from that strategic imperative of China's, it makes sense to decarbonize their EV fleet. And we touched on that a little bit in our EV episode with Ashley Nunez, where I was actually trying to poke him a little bit more on that question of, okay, if you have a pragmatic need to decarbonize, not a virtue signaling need to decarbonize, what does that look like in terms of your approach to EVs? And, from the research I was doing, it was more around, okay, what are our vehicles that actually have really high odometer numbers? Our microbuses, our taxis, et cetera. We're going to electrify those first. We're not going to focus on sort of luxury Teslas. We're going to make, affordable EVs that, people can drive and actually reduce our use of liquid hydrocarbons. And we'll use coal, we'll use wind, we'll use solar, we'll use nuclear to provide the electricity to do that. And so anyway, that's my sort of, again, long-winded playback to, the earlier echoes of this conversation. But yeah, let's talk about how to respond to Australia's geostrategic challenges with those energy things in mind, and also in terms of best use of limited resources, I guess kind of rearmament, procurement, triage for things that might not even look like conventional weapon systems.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a really good setting. And I suppose one of the first things that I would sort of think about is trying to figure out what Australia wants from its maritime access approaches strategy in war, because I think it absolutely changes in a second when we realize that we can't send ships to Asia or get ships to Asia. Most of our shipping doesn't matter anymore. Like, we have like 10x our ship movements are exports that make us rich, but they're going to places that we won't be able to trade with in a war. So it's done. So that like most of our ports, most of our ships, we just don't need to, we wouldn't need to care about defend whatsoever. The question is what ships do we need to defend, and where are they going to and from? This is for our own, I suppose, security of our critical supplies. And I think that there has to be a question seriously asked in Australia now about what we do about liquid fuel. Because either we need to be able to figure out whether we can secure access to liquid fuel in a crisis against someone that is willing to shed blood, ours and theirs, to stop us getting access to that. We have to have that hard conversation. What do we think is necessary, and what is sufficient to meet that thing that is necessary? And I think we quickly come to the point where we should be scratching all options to figure out whether we can supply ourselves with those liquid hydrocarbons. And I think there's ways of doing that, which is an idea we can put a pin in terms of thinking about how to get unconventional oil, particularly out of some of the coal resources we have in Australia. So if we don't need oil, Australia needs a remarkably small amount of stuff, I think, in a war. Because most of our containers are filled with sort of, cheap consumer goods and T-shirts and sand shoes and, manufactured garden chairs from Asia or whatever else. So the containers we really need and we depend on in a war are going to be fairly high-tech things that will support critical industry. Like they're going to be the milling machines and the conveyor belts and advanced bearings or whatever else. The machines that build machines is the stuff that we really need. We'll need in a war. And that'll be a relatively low volume of trade. It'll be really important. But we can get that from basically Europe and America. And the other bizarre feature of Australia's kind of geography is that whilst our top half is sort of smothered in this island archipelago that the Japanese overran in 4 months, we have 3 other coasts that are thousands of kilometres long that have completely bare, open access to the biggest oceans there are, basically. So, we don't need to go anywhere near Asia. I'm talking not within 1,000 miles, not within 2,000 miles, not within 3,000 miles, not within like multiple excessive kind of combat strike ranges of multiple aircraft and multiple. Like, we can stay away from so much military stuff if we give up going through Asia. We can just stay miles away from Asia if we choose to just trade via the very, very open oceans from our southern ports to go to the UK and or Europe for those bare things. And I think that volume of trade, particularly if it's a small enough volume that you can put it on to maybe faster ships, becomes extremely hard to disrupt, even for certainly for aircraft. It's got to go so far from sort of from Asia to get to the kind of the southern bits of Australia, and we should have some air force between that can kind of make that a little bit hard. But the big threat there really comes from nuclear powered submarines. Because if they get into your ports or in the kind of near approaches to your ports, then you've really got a problem, and that's hard work to. And if they can threaten to lay mines, which a nuclear submarine, a big one, certainly can, that's a serious problem. So I think that Australia's naval fleet and the complexity of us trying to do exports can be massively simplified, because we may not have to export. Like the gift of our geography, that we are so damn far away from Asia in our southern ports, might mean that if we commit to sailing just to Europe and America and not even going near Asia, we might not need escorting. Might be a much more simplified problem for us, actually. And then you come to the question of how do you keep your ports safe from submarines? And the deepest irony, and I think the kind of backwardness of Australia, and of course you can see why naval people hate this, right? Absolutely viscerally hate this suggestion, is that we don't need any of our naval warfighting capability on a ship. Like, to protect our critical ports, right? We need to be freaking amazing at anti-submarine warfare. Absolutely awesome. But it's all within kind of like those near approaches to ports, right? And it's going to be land-based helicopters, small fast boats, maybe seabed sensors, maybe some slow unmanned drone type things for sort of making mobile kind of sonar pickets to patrol areas. But if we can make our southern ports submarine sanitized, like there is no chance that a submarine can nestle in and get close to those areas. Our seaborne trade that we depend on for survival, not to get rich, that's done. No point defending that. The seaborne trade that we depend on for survival can be a very, very small amount of high value things that we get from Europe and America, and we just need to defend around those ports. So that's the southern half, making, I think, that our ports submarine sanitized, and we have the incredible blessings of distance that make us hard to interfere with, except for nuclear submarines in particular. And the other critical half of Australia's strategy has to be to make sure that no one else, a hostile power, can't establish, like the Japanese did, secure maritime supply lines in our northern approaches, right? So we can't afford to have what happened in the first few months of the Japanese entering the war in the Pacific happen again. We can't have Indonesia overrun. If we have land-based air forces that can fight ours within strike range of Australian shores, our strategic geography changes completely, because they can use lots of small planes to defend ships from, particularly from aircraft, I suppose. The submarines are potentially still useful there. But our strategic geography changes massively if we have suddenly, strong air bases and secure ports that someone else controls in northern approaches. So to do that, I think the best and easiest thing for us to do is to make sure that we have a pretty strong air force. And the only air force that matters, in my opinion, I think this has been sort of confirmed through lots of points of history, such as Pearl Harbor, the attack on Darwin, for example, which was a huge attack, as heavy as on Pearl Harbor, actually slightly heavier.
Really?
Yeah, I think there were more planes flown, more tons of bombs dropped on Darwin. I think so.
And just for the non-Australian listener, Darwin is the big naval port. Is it the biggest northernmost city? And
it's not even a naval port. We have patrol boats there, and that's it. Our big naval ports are in Sydney and Fremantle and Perth, and so we have. But it was a big supply base in World War II. And now, by the way, we've sold the port of Darwin to the Chinese. That's an eyebrow-raising thing that a lot of Australians kind of wonder about, which is foreign direct investment kind of curls your toenails. But Darwin is currently a patrol boat port only, but around Darwin and south of Darwin is where our air bases are. And that's the place where your short-range strike aircraft, which are crucial for sinking ships as much as anything else, like that's where they're based. And I think that the key thing for us is to make sure that we have a strong air force after a massive preemptive strike. It's the only air force that matters, is the air force that you can put in the sky the day after someone has had a massive, overwhelming swing at it. And I think that I think, and this is where I sort of enjoy sort of sharing with you and anyone who cares to listen, that the right thing for us to do to make sure that we have a freaking amazing air force, or a relatively good one, the day after an overwhelming strike, is not to buy more planes or more expensive radar sets and defensive systems for the existing air bases. It's just to pour more concrete and have more, longer, wider runways, lots and lots of them, and lots of hangars, lots of apron space, lots of redundant fuel storage that's appropriately spaced, etc. Lots of redundant weapons bunkers, so that the number of missiles that are required, long-range, high-precision missiles that's required to land on base to actually debilitate the Air Force, goes up. And you don't need to buy more planes for that. I think we should assume basically there will be an overwhelming strike, and my assumption again, like I'm a huge skeptic of kind of like shoot the arrow kind of missile defense systems. It's not that they don't work; they can work, but where they've been found to work, they've generally been built up under fire, like the Israelis have done, like the Ukrainians have done eventually with the Patriot missiles. But like I don't know many instances of where on the first day, with the massive overwhelming strike happened, like that you've never experienced before. That all your anti-missile defenses just worked perfectly and nothing got through. I think that's a relatively delicate defense investment, and more or less, actually, I think that we're doing the dumb ally thing, where we basically we are volunteering to pay our ally for an expensive bit of kit that they need themselves anyway, and they would bring to us anyway if they chose to want to really defend North Australia anyway. But we're volunteering to pay up front so that we can feel like we own a piece of that, when in fact the thing that would probably matter to us, but also to the Americans, is if we just have the redundancy and depth of the tarmac, the hangars, the fuel storage, the supply lines, the weapons bunkers, that meant that on the second day after a massive overwhelming strike, not only were there enough planes that were in the empty hangar, or enough planes, I mean, we should play the shell game with planes, right? Like, the cheapest way of defending a plane is not to build a really, really hard hangar, but build 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 next to it and have just one plane in there. And the huge advantage that Australia can have from that is that if America does want to and can come and defend us, that means they can come quickly, right? Because they did come eventually. Like, Australia became a massive American, we've done all these steps before, except last time we did it basically by getting the crap kicked out of us first. Had all our soldiers taken hostage in Singapore, literally, and then had the Americans come and win the air battle, and we just turned them back and go. And we got our Darwin absolutely annihilated, pretty terrible. And then the Americans still, because they'd managed to hold off the Japanese kind of naval movements, were able to rebuild bases in Northern Australia and do a fantastic supply job. But if we can have what took a few years of rebuilding, having gotten the crap kicked out of us first, us survive that initial onslaught and be able to rebuild and sort of resupply American air power in the north in a few months, that I think makes us a very, very secure country. And that I think makes it more likely that America will want to stay and defend us. If defending Australia looks easy, looks good, then I think that that's potentially the biggest gift that we can give America as an ally, is to be the ally that doesn't need rescuing, the ally that's easy to come and extend a hand to, because they've kept their own patch safe.
Unsinkable aircraft carrier.
That's it.
Unsinkable aircraft carrier of Northern Australia.
That's it. If we can do that and have a fuel supply system, that's the other thing, right? When America looks at Australia and says, "Gee, where do we go and how should we fight this thing?" Once they realise their aircraft carriers can't go in the first island chain, etc., where do you repivot to? A place that has fuel and lots of it, and refining capacity and redundant supply lines and depth. That looks like a place that's worth defending. If you've still got to solve all the problems that Australia's never thought of about how the heck you get fuel into the northern part of Australia, whilst fighting potentially a contested sort of air battle to do that, then I think that we look like a difficult place to defend, and America will think about what its priorities are and where else to invest. But that I think is the easiest thing to do, which is not buying fancy new planes or expensive radars and anti-missile missiles, but pouring lots of concrete and tarmac, and making sure that we can accommodate literally America unloading half their naval air power into the north of Australia if they want to. Suits us pretty well too, even if they don't want to do that.
So far, the Morrison plan, and I'll have to further frame that as the Aidan Morrison plan, because you do have a former prime minister who was a Morrison. Doesn't look a lot like conventional sort of military procurement. It's actually strengthening one or two southern harbors to enable access to that shipping that's thousands of miles away from Asia. Doesn't actually involve buying a lot of boats, as you mentioned, helicopters, anti-submarine warfare devices, drones, etc. The strategy in the north doesn't involve buying tons of expensive interceptor missiles and aircraft. It's more, pouring concrete, building hangars, as you've mentioned. And then we did put a pin in it, but I think this pin is one we need to poke further. I'm not sure what the analogy is here. But this idea, again, of this issue of the liquid hydrocarbons and how the current, essentially all of Australia's naval assets, I guess not the diesel subs because they can't actually go very far, but all of its surface ships would need to accompany liquid hydrocarbon imports in a time of war in a convoy fashion, because that's absolutely essential shipping versus the less essential luxury shipping, as you were sort of portraying to. But let's talk about what Australia's options are for liquid hydrocarbons. Again, shining it back on China. They do have, I think, the China Synfuels Corporation. They make 100,000 barrels per day of oil, 36.5 million barrels per year, if I'm putting that accurately. I don't know how that compares to their overall consumption. It's probably a drop in the bucket, but certainly they're diversifying. It's not cheap, but it's there for them, presumably, as they think in a way that is potentially more mature than Western policymakers who, again, are not considering things like military grand strategy. So what options does Australia have in terms of developing its own, at least potential for decreasing its dependence on liquid hydrocarbons beyond electrification of transportation, such as that's possible?
Yeah. And I suppose to start there with electrification, I think the electrification can go some way for our city-based urban transport system. That might make some good sense. But we have such a big rump of tasks that are hard to electrify at scale, heavy trucking, tractors, like mines, and that sort of thing. So it seems like that we will depend for as far as the eye can see, we will depend on a fair bit of hydrocarbons that are essential to keep the place running. Options we have, right? So either we can kind of dig more and try to discover more oil. Like there is oil in the ground. It's just kind of a question of how costly and expensive it is to extract various things. And I'm sure that if you put some more effort into it, you'd find at a price some resources somewhere in Australia that could be developed that could be quite expensive. Another option is biofuels, because Australia does have agricultural capacity to an extent, although curiously, one of the kind of differentiating things between the American net zero study and the Australian net zero study is that it was found that biofuels were less of a feature in Australia because we didn't have on average as much good soil paired with good rainfall as the US has. So the capacity for kind of really intensive agricultural crops like corn or that sort of stuff we have some, we can do anything in Australia, but it's to scale it up massively might be potentially not that easy. It's a cost to weigh up though. Or the other thing is kind of other unconventional ways of getting oil, including solid to oil, like solid liquefying coal, basically. So this is something that I know has been done before. It's not an unknown technology. It's been done in South Africa. It's done in Nazi Germany too. When there is a will, you find a way, and you can basically create synthetic crude from solids and coal. And there's a process that's been pioneered and developed at least to some sort of piloting level in Australia that involves turning brown coal to crude oil and purer carbon, something close to anthracite, I think, which is hard coal. And so that's particularly interesting, I think, because apparently it's easier to do with brown coal than that. And brown coal is kind of the very dirtiest thing that if you just burn it, like it's wet, it's sort of, up to 60% water. So burning that in terms of the carbon intensity that you have for as a power source is pretty bad. Like it's up to 1,400 grams per kilowatt hour, I think, in sort of the worst of Australia's coal plants. Hazelwood that closed down a couple of years ago. But if you convert it into something that you absolutely need, it's essential, like oil and harder black coal, it starts to look a little more appealing than just burning it from an environmental perspective. But also potentially cleaner, because brown coal does not have the concentrations of some of the metals and stuff that you can find in black coal too. So appealing possibility is sort of, basically biomass that's just laid down for a few million years, not too many million years, or is it? I think it's a couple of million years at least. But we have no shortage of that. Like Victoria is pretty much the Saudi Arabia of brown coal, and we're not going to run out of that anytime soon. So that's another option to consider, I suppose. It's politically so toxic for some reason. Like it's basically just banned in Victoria. Like the kind of thing, anything with brown coal, anything with coal is kind of evil, more or less. But Australia's hydrocarbon situation is such that I think that when we wake up to it having only 28 days of fuel or something like that, it's just so untenable. And the options for whether we can do anything better than that is pretty poor, unless we're quite confident that we can get access to a friend and refinement capacity. The question about where refinement capacity, do you just import refined products, right? But potentially if you can import from the US or from the Middle East, steering clear of Asia, that's also possible. Like the ocean's big, the Indian Ocean's real big. So there is a possibility about whether that geography actually helps if we can import some, but then do we rely on other people to refine it for us? Because the refinement capacity we currently depend on is in Asia. And I don't think in a crisis we can count on those ships getting through. So yeah, I think that we do have options, but weighing up which of those, kind of like, defending the ships we need to go to the Gulf or America, or biofuels, or coal to liquids, coal to oil conversion technologies. They're the choices I think we have. We have to look at them pretty seriously.
I wanted to just close, just thinking a little bit again about power generation in general for the grid, and you can find all kinds of interesting vulnerabilities. I think transmission is probably a massive one in transformer stations. In terms of, and again, I don't know, I have to be careful talking about this even, right? But in terms of vulnerabilities of our grid, where are the weak points, and what do the weak points look like in different power generation scenarios? Be that a whole bunch of coal plants all sitting within a few miles of each other in the Latrobe or Hunter Valley. There's a vulnerability there in terms of I'm not sure what kind of ordnance could knock those out all at once. Similarly, we've seen the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant taken over by the Russians. That could be a nuclear plant, could also be a target, with some kind of conventional or unconventional weapon. So you can imagine all kinds of different nightmare scenarios about, different vulnerabilities for different power generation systems. The Israeli pager attack, and then the next day the walkie-talkie attack, and then the next day I'm not sure how many solar panel rooftop fires there were in Lebanon, but that, and again, this is sort of at the edge of my consciousness. I've not looked into this deeply, and I'm not just trying to I'm hopefully fear mongering about all technologies here equally. But that was interesting, just in terms of the amount of solar kit that comes in, made in China. As we move into this more distributed warfare, drone warfare, lots of small things rather than big things. The potential for, I don't know, this is the kind of nightmare apocalyptic vision of what a strike on a nuclear plant might be, would be 3.6 million, rooftop fires in Australia, as there's some weird sort of stuck next worm that's in the solar inverter. I don't know. I'm probably being totally paranoid, and Simon Holmes Accord, if you're listening, you'll go, oh god damn it, Kiefer's at it again, fear mongering about solar. And point taken, but I am just curious, if you have any thoughts about, in general, those different vulnerabilities, different systems, or...
Definitely have thoughts about those. So firstly, the question about concentration versus dispersion, I think that's the right axis on which to think about so many problems in so many fields, economics, like business organizations, generalization, specialization. It's all a concentration versus dispersion kind of question in my mind. And when you concentrate things together, you get these beautiful peacetime economies of scale that are just great. You get bigger systems. It's mostly internal volume to surface ratio sort of things, bigger ships, right? And I think the same is true for a lot of industry. And I've certainly been a fan of this for kind of nuclear power stations. I've been a huge skeptic of the small modular reactor idea, about whether they will be ever economically sort of viable compared to large ones. But there are fantastic economies of scale, economies of concentrating on sites too. Like, the nuclear learnings always seem to be more of the same reactor at the same site by the same company. Like, you've got to really concentrate there to get things to work beautifully. So in terms of efficiencies of industrial processes, including creating energy, things get better and better and better in peacetime by basically making it bigger and more concentrated. And like Latrobe Valley, I think in Victoria, right, the whole cluster of power stations pretty close together. And I think that you get a community of people that all know and work, and in that sort of area, I think there's economies of scale there, and returns to concentration there too. The question is about how does that scale to war and security? And I think in normal cases, right, I genuinely think that basically the closer you get to a contested, the front line, a hot space where you can expect the other guys to be able to bring resources within strike range, the more and more you have to basically consider dispersion, right? It is a necessary and essential trade-off where you need to have more redundant things separated apart. So there's more things that your enemy has to think about taking out, as opposed to just one really big one that's easy to find. So that concentration dispersion trade-off is just essential. And that's why, by the way, we would have an air force in the top of Australia, lots of small planes, and ports in the bottom, which can facilitate the big ships. It's like, because that's so much closer to the threat, it has to be more concentrated. You have lots of separate hangars, lots of separate airfields. So that's the dispersed force because it is close to a serious threat. But when it comes to energy systems, there is a massive, massive catch, right, that is built into I think some poor assumptions about renewable energy systems, right? Because in order for dispersion having to work, to have lots of smaller things as opposed to clumping it to get a big one, for that to still create a more robust system, the separate bits have to be kind of redundant. They need to stand sort of alone and be able to be literally kind of equivalent replacements, so that when one bit gets taken out, all the others are kind of still okay. And that makes your system slower to degrade. And that's why, combat forces, you have big structures are further away to the rear, and, your echelons get closer to the front. You get more and more smaller and lighter and dug in and spread out. And so that trade-off is inevitable. But in renewable energy systems that are dominated by particularly variable intermittent kind of sources like wind and solar and inverter-based resources, the problem is that even these things are incredibly dispersed, they are not totally redundant, and they depend often extremely heavily on some other bit of the system being there and working in the way that was planned to at the right time and capacities and stages that it was planned to. And we've seen this in a spectacular case just recently in Australia, where Broken Hill, a sort of very remote town out very far inland in Australia, on the end of one long transmission line, that also had really good wind resources and a massive wind farm and a big solar farm and a big battery storage farm and a couple of gas backup generators, had the power line go down and they had a blackout, like a bad blackout for days, right? And so and it's a big question about sort of, how robust is this system? And I think, and the answer, to give credit to the renewable people, right? If you'd planned it properly and you had all the right things, and the big problem they had is that the battery they built there was not configured to be able to be a grid-forming battery, right? So that it could not set the regular kind of frequency in the oscillating current, alternating current, and so it wasn't set up to do the thing that it needed to do at the time. One of the generators was in pieces being maintained, and one of them was not well enough maintained to handle the whole load. And then as well, you had issues like during the solar period that you had peak outputs of, for example, all the rooftop solar. Those peak outputs then created issues because then you'd have to reduce the generator to such a low level that it couldn't now provide the stability services that it relied on for the whole grid. So you've got distributed systems everywhere, a whole bunch of different pieces. but they all have to work together. Exactly, right? So they're all the critical kind of somewhat vulnerability where if you didn't have enough of one, the others might not function. And there was no generation from all the wind and the solar farms that were able to get to the town because they were connected to the transmission line. They were repairing the transmission line, couldn't connect them to the grid at all, right? So it was not safe to be working and repairing the same lines as were required to get some power out of it. So you had dispersed systems, but utterly dependent on one another. And that is the truly most vulnerable system where you've got a massive array of dispersed things, many of which will be critical to a whole bunch of other things. Because then you only need to take out like one switch yard here and then suddenly, this area can't get access from that big stabilizing sort of a synchronous engine here. That means you can't put in this part for the rest of the grid. So you've got lots of systems very spread out, lots of which might be critical. And I suppose the ultimate vulnerability of that would be if there's something wrong with electronics, right? Like, if there's some vulnerability we have in having imported mostly from China huge amounts of consumer, rooftop panels and battery systems and the inverters that go with them and the smart meters that go with them. If that was vulnerable to some kind of hack, then that's a hugely pervasive common vulnerability that I think would disrupt the whole system. So I think that, as you would know, if anyone that knows anything about sort of electrical systems, synchronous generators that have large spinning masses attached to them, they are stability and robustness sort of embodied for the grid that they support. Like they've got huge capacity of ride through and stabilization to that heartbeat, the pulse that everything else has to contribute to and sort of follow in the inverter-based technologies. So those systems give robustness to a grid. And I think that when you consider how to do those economically, you do concentrate them together. If you're sure in a defense way, you can defend them, right? So it means that you do have an area, I think, that is your kind of concentrated generation area. And you do prioritize some defensive assets around that. You make sure that, there's a radar that sees incoming threats and you've got, if your air force is nearby, whatever else. So you do need to make sure that you defend and consider those vulnerabilities because they are sort of all in one place. But nuclear power plants, I think, are probably the most hard and robust probably of all the sort of power plants we sort of currently have by virtue of the sort of safe to engineer to them. But they are not the most soft target. It would be the switch yards. It'd be the switch yards and things that, and as we've seen this in Ukraine, like there's no longer a question anymore. Like, you can take out an electricity system by damaging the grid infrastructure most easily. That's, you see it, like it's open yards of, transformers and stuff. We don't currently block that into concrete. So yeah, I'm not concerned about nuclear reactors or a generally very concentrated electricity generation system in the south of Australia, because we are so far away from the where the action's really hot. We might have to defend some things there, but I think that's the way it works. And yeah, I think that a distributed renewable energy system will be a remarkable vulnerability. And it's the opposite has been argued by a few people in Australia in the ASPI strategists are saying that, oh no, nuclear reactors are such a vulnerability, a single point of failure, but actually a gazillion points of failure that are enmeshed together and kind of just holding each other together in a sort of big delicate web, which is what I think the renewable energy dominated system looks like, is a far more delicate system than I think big synchronous generators.
Yeah, I mean, I think like in a post, zombie apocalypse world, having a solar panel and a battery and being able to, do some very basic stuff sounds like a decent amount of resilience. I guess it just depends on like how back towards the Stone Age we go. In heaven forbid the scenario of a great power, non-nuclear but hot conflict, which disrupts our globalized world. And I think this podcast really tries hard to look at how the sausage gets made from an energy and materials perspective. We probably haven't done quite enough on trade, but it's a scary world out there in terms of mutually assured economic destruction. I think like the intertwining of the Chinese and U.S. economies are a powerful factor that avoids a kind of hot conflict there. Being in Canada, part of kind of fortress North America, we are really ideally positioned. We're kind of like Australia, except that we have the liquid hydrocarbons. We're far away from tons of different adversaries and have big coastlines and big open waterways and resilient infrastructure. But yeah, it's a scary world thinking about military conflict disrupting just international shipping and the impacts that would have. And I mean, the very real impacts, like famines we're talking about, if countries that, have been able to, economically develop and build big population bases, but, only have one or two of the ingredients of a global, of an industrialized economy, all of a sudden fall short of that through disruption of trade networks. It's a really scary world, and I don't like imagining it. But this has been a very, I think, interesting and productive thought exercise. I want to close maybe by, again, just kind of counterpointing the sort of seriousness. I mean, this is sort of in some ways a fantasy conversation, because thank God, we're not in the midst of a war, and maybe war is far off or never going to happen. That's probably very naive. But there's another sort of fantasy conversation. I remember when Secretary Granholm famously started saying that maybe we could have Abrams battle tanks, which were, battery powered, I think it's like a 70-ton vehicle. This kind of idea of we're going to just decarbonize the military. And I guess, nuclear subs should be very popular amongst the greenies because we're decarbonizing the military. Anyway, there's a reason why, the U.S. military is one of the biggest consumers of hydrocarbons in the world. That dense, multifunctional, source of energy, transportable, versatile, abundant, is pretty pragmatic when it comes to kind of these real world defense issues. So,
I couldn't agree more, Chris. The idea of, sort of 45 megajoules a kilogram, like liquid hydrocarbons, like, it is such an asset. I just can't imagine like anyone trading down to 1 megajoule per kilogram lithium batteries and thinking that's going to be a good thing in the utmost pinch point, like in a military conflict. So I think that the military is the last thing that should ever, it's just so many applications in the military that you just won't ever decarbonize. It's just a stupid, fanciful idea. And so you've got to think about what's your minimum capacity to produce and use these fuels, and what are you relying them for. And it's sobering. But you're so right. The world has flourished in peaceful, benign circumstances by producing abundance and consistency of abundance of sort of energy and transport and manufactured goods, and that requires quite incredible relationships and supply lines. And lucky America, Australia doesn't realize that, you guys can, Americans can leave and go back to North America. They will still be safe through the most wild ride that Asia can have if they want to be in their own mainland. So we need to think about this in a little bit more of there's an extra edge of realpolitik for Australia, because we can't leave Asia, which our American allies can. So profoundly interesting.
Even with a nuclear-powered propeller on one of your coasts.
That's right.
Listeners, while I still have your attention, especially the diehards that stick around for an hour and 27-minute podcast so far, it is, I believe, U.S. kind of tax season. People are thinking about making tax-deductible donations. You can do that to Decouple. Look on the website and the donate button. I think it's called Give Butter. We have a 501(c) fiscal sponsorship arrangement. We definitely are ambitious and want to do exciting things with the podcast, and beyond just sustaining it. So please give generously if you're in the US and can do so. Also, we have the ability to pledge on Substack. We're really trying to move content there. Subscribe there, like there, share stories there, build the buzz there. Same thing on YouTube, guys and gals. Really appreciate all the support. Aidan, appreciate your support coming on as a fascinating guest. This was a lot of fun. You are number 2 in the charts, at least on the podcast side of things, not on YouTube yet, with our episode on just how cheap are wind and solar. So it's totally awesome having you back, and I look forward to many more conversations to come.
Thanks, Chris.